Welcome back, everybody. I'm Professor G, and today what I want to do is give you a very brief introduction to the Greek philosopher Plato, and by extension give you a general introduction to Greek philosophy sort of as a whole. Now, in order to do this, I would like to begin this video with a thought experiment. And give me a second, this might seem silly at first, but there's a larger point that I'm trying to draw out here. So, what I have here, I have two bottles of smart water. These bottles they're basically identical to each other. They look the same, they feel the same. I imagine that if I opened it up, they would taste the same. They're the same, yet they're different, right? So I recognize them as looking the same, yet I also recognize them as being two different things. And so what we are presented with here is the problem of universals. How is it that we have one category in our head, water bottles, and yet we can recognize all these different forms of water bottles in the real world? What is it that connects these water bottles? Now, that might seem like a pretty silly problem, but it gets a bit more complicated and a bit more serious once we start considering more pertinent topics. For example, issues of morality. What is it that makes something good? Now, we have a lot of different examples of what good things are, right? Giving to the poor is a good thing. Being nice to people in your day-to-day life, in your day-to-day conversation at the office or at your house, that's good. That's a good action. Taking care of a loved one, bringing in shelter dogs, assisting with Habitat for Humanity, all these things we would say are good. But what is it that connects these things? What is it that makes an action good? And this is a bit more complicated because in order to answer that question, we have to say, not give an example of what a good thing is, but rather speak about what goodness itself is. What is goodness? Right? What is it that unites all of these actions as good, as the general category of good? This is known as the problem of universals. And the problem of universals is what Plato is going to be trying to get at in most of his dialogues. In the dialogue that you're reading, the Euthyphro, this is a problem that Plato is going to deal with. What makes an action virtuous? What is piety? So before we get back to that question, let me give you a brief introduction to philosophy and to Plato. So, Greek philosophy begins in 585 with a gentleman named Thales who lived in modern-day Turkey on the on the western seaboard, kind of where Turkey almost bumps up to Greece. It's called Anatolia back then. Thales lived in that region, and we say that Thales is the first philosopher and that philosophy begins in Greece in 585 because Thales, in the year 585, predicts the first solar eclipse. And this is significant not because it hadn't been done before. If you read, for example, anything about the history of the Native Americans in both North and South America, you would know that the Mayans had been doing this for quite some time. Not only that had the Mayans been doing this for quite some time, but the Mayans were pretty damn good at it. They were so good at it that they were able to predict eclipses hundreds of years from when the Mayan calendar was written. It's incredible how accurate the Mayans were. Yet Thales' prediction of an eclipse is different because it's not predicated upon any sort of religious belief. Thales predicates his prediction of the eclipse on naturalistic explanations. And by doing so, Thales separates philosophy from religion. And this is something that doesn't happen across the globe, okay? Philosophy is something that is distinctly Greek, distinctly Western, but it's quickly adopted by other civilizations, for example, such as Arab civilizations during the Middle Ages. But there is a distinction in the West between philosophy on the one hand and religion on the other. So when we talked about Confucianism and Taoism, there's not this distinction. So Confucianism and Taoism, it incorporates philosophical and religious elements. Western philosophy is a search for a fundamental understanding of the world around us through the process of critical thinking and critical discussion. It doesn't assume the things that religion assumes. Right? Religion assumes that there is more to this world than what we can see, more to this world than physical reality, that reality has some sort of spiritual dimension to it, that God intervenes directly, perhaps, into reality. Philosophy doesn't make this assumption. It's not to say that philosophers don't believe this. Most philosophers throughout Western history have been religious, but that's not the point. Philosophy is built upon critical thinking, built upon human reason, our capability for rational thought, and being able to prove propositions not through an appeal to religion, but rather through an appeal to reason, reason that is shared by all of us. So Thales begins the philosophical tradition, but it's Plato who really comes to embody Greek philosophy. And Plato shifts the direction of philosophy. Plato makes philosophy more interested in a subject area known as ethics. Ethics addressing the central question of how should I live my life? What should I do given a particular situation? What is right? What is wrong? And how do I know these things? And Plato is trying to provide a real answer, a tangible, physical, rational answer for this general question. So he provides us with a universal ethic based on his theory of the forms. So getting back to the whole water bottle thing, right? I have all these different water bottles I see. What is that central concept that unites these, that lets me know that both of these are in fact water bottles? Likewise, how is it that I'm able to look at certain individual actions, such as somebody giving to the poor on the one hand, and somebody helping an old lady across the street on the other? How do those two things relate to each other? How can I look at both of those things and say, yeah, both of those are good actions? What is that goodness that unites them? And in order to answer this question, Plato introduces his theory of the forms. The idea that all of these individual instances are simply imperfect representations of some more perfect reality. Now that might sound a bit tricky, but basically that we were able to recognize goodness in different actions because we have within ourselves a notion of universal goodness. And that universal goodness informs how we view individual actions. And that universal goodness exists. It doesn't exist in this world. It exists in the perfect world, the realm of the forms. But Plato isn't saying like this is exactly how reality is. Plato is not that sort of philosopher or thinker. He's simply, the theory of the forms is more, it's called the theory of the forms, but it's more of a hypothesis. It's Plato's best guess. Now it's a theory in the sense that it unites all of these individual instances of ethics under a general umbrella, but even Plato isn't quite sure that he's right throughout his dialogues. He's in constant debate and discussion with different people. He's trying out, he's reworking this idea of the forms to see where it's weakest, to see where it's strongest. He's not dogmatically committed, and this is the characteristic of the philosopher, that this is why we call Plato the philosopher, as well, apart from Aristotle, but this is why Plato comes to embody philosophy, this this committed search to understanding the world through reason, and through reason alone, and not being dogmatically committed to the idea that you're right, because as Plato shows time and time again throughout his dialogues, you're probably wrong. And we have to find other people who are smarter than us, who are better than us, who know more than us, and we seek these people out, and we bounce ideas off of them, and say, hey, this is what I think, what do you think? And so this is the form that Plato's writing takes. It comes in the form of a dialogue, typically between Socrates, who was Plato's teacher, between Socrates and some other person, his interlocutor, whoever he's arguing with. Now in the reading that you have, Socrates is arguing with a man named Euthyphro. And they're arguing over this idea of piety. So, you have the trial and the death of Socrates, both of which Plato writes about. So Euthyphro represents Socrates. He's going to the courthouse. He's about to be tried. And as he's about to be tried, he sees Euthyphro walking up. And Socrates asks Euthyphro, what are you doing here? They go through this big discussion, which you'll be able to read there. And basically, Euthyphro is bringing charges against his father for killing a slave, for killing one of his own slaves. And Socrates says, well, you know, that's pretty crazy. You're trying your own father in court? You must be pretty committed to this idea of piety that you have. And Euthyphro says, of course, I know what piety is. I know what the gods want. And so they enter in this conversation. This conversation is going to center around this concept of piety. What does it mean to be pious? How do you know the action that you're doing is pious? Because after all, a lot hangs on this question. Euthyphro is trying his own father for murder because he believes he knows what's right. And so Socrates is going to question this. Well, if you're willing to go that far, surely you must know what piety is. And so they're going to get in this debate here. And so I want to set that up for you because Euthyphro is going to be given a lot of examples of piety, but when Socrates asks what is piety, he's not looking for examples of piety. He wants to know what piety is in and of itself. What is this thing that unites all of these examples that we would say, oh yeah, that's pious, that's pious, that's pious? How do we recognize all of those things as piety? So, give the Euthyphro a good read-through. Contact me if you have any questions. See you guys next time.